Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have an upload of terrifying encounters to share with you. Before we get into them, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. The links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below. My merch is displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe, click the like button, and please leave a comment. It really does help, and it really does matter. And now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get on with today's upload. Shall we? Today's first encounter. When I was 16, I lived in a rural town in central Illinois near Starved Rock and had an experience with an unknown and mysterious animal. We lived at the edge of town, and there was a large field directly to the right of our home and a set of train tracks behind our backyard. A line of forest. As kids, without too much to do in a small town, we would walk these tracks pretty frequently. We'd often run into other kids doing the same. It was a pretty cool place, actually, with all of the nature and trees, and till that day, was even a nice escape to go for a long walk when stressed. Like any other time, we went down the tunnel of trees that led to a little path that would walk us down an embankment before the railroad tracks. We had a normal walk for 10 minutes or so, just talking about our boyfriends and our current favorite memes. Some really 2011 memes. Once we reached the bridge over the tracks, that was about 3 blocks down from my house. That's when things started to get strange. I found a carcass of a 2-foot large fish that had obviously been torn into by some predator without much left but bone. Keep in mind that this is a little ways inland and the river was still a good trek by foot and would require a large animal to carry that size fish so far. A little further down, a breadcrumb trail of white fluff scattered through the tall grass on the opposite side of the tracks. To me, it looked like an animal had been hurt, and me being the animal lover, but a stupid 16-year-old one at that, I thought it'd be a grand idea to keep investigating. I followed the trail of fluff, which led me to a fresh deer leg and nothing else. Just past the deer leg, then about 15 feet or so, I walked directly up the opposite embankment from the original to see a large, den-like tunnel. Immediately walking up to it, I felt like I should not be there, and my friend also felt the same. I retreated backwards, feeling that I should not turn my back on that den. Scared out of our minds at that point, we decided it was probably best to get back because God knew what else we would find, or would find us. And it was about 30 minutes before dark anyway. On the way back, though, we were not alone. We heard grass moving on the embankment the whole way beside us on the side that we would have had to cross to get back to my yard. You could hear it. It was slow and deliberate, moving through the grass, and every now and then a few rapid ones, if we moved any quicker. We felt hunted, with no weapons but the rocks on the tracks. We hurled a few of them and shouted to get whatever it was away far enough so that we could get back up the embankment. This worked, and we thought that was that once we had reached my yard. This is the part where I would go back and slap myself. We were so stupid, we decided that we would hang out on the trampoline that had a clear view of the field next door for the next hour until my mom's friend came to pick her up. The sun had fallen to the point where only shapes and different levels of darkness were clear on the field. Suddenly something large, dark, and low to the ground came out of the tree line and onto the field. It stopped and turned to us, I was frozen and immediately told my friend to stay still. We could only see the darkness of the creature's fur and its movements slightly cat-like stalking. To this point, I'd say, oh, cougar or something. However, I'm not sure if they've been found in our area for a very, very long time. The thing that threw me the most was the sound it made. It sounded angry, that was for sure, but the thing made low huffing pants, like a bull blowing air through its nose before a charge. I turned to my friend and said, "Run." We booked it to my house, and to this day I feel like something was helping me and was forcing my feet to pick up quicker than I had ever ran. I've seen plenty of deer, coyote, fox, and all there, but nothing this big or predatory. Nothing in the local fauna matches up, and I am extremely confused about what animals would move like that and sound like that, plus be in that area. Today's second encounter. The house I grew up in had a decent chunk of woods behind it. I played there all of the time, and one time when I was about 10 years old, I saw a fox in the woods. It ran away from me, but would turn around and stare at me multiple times. From then on, I always wanted to find this fox. Anyway, one day my friend and I were standing on my porch, and I glanced out into the backyard up by the tree line. I saw the fox at the edge of the woods watching me. Occasionally, it would turn its head to the side, then back at me. I grabbed my friend and pointed at the fox. She kept telling me that she didn't see anything, but I was almost sure that's what I was seeing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something else in the woods, perhaps 50 feet away from the fox. It was a black dog chomping its jaw up and down like it was eating something. I owned a black dog, so I didn't think much about it, and I looked back at the fox. My friend suddenly says, "I don't see the fox you're talking about," but I could have sworn I just saw a black dog opening and closing its mouth. But it was only for a split second. It didn't click for me right away that she saw what I saw. Soon, I was just frustrated and started walking toward the woods, only to realize that the fox I was so sure of was just a reddish bush swaying in the wind. I didn't have the greatest eyesight, but I didn't know that. Suddenly, I thought back to the black dog. The more I thought about it, it didn't look normal. From what I could remember, it had a stout-like body like a pit bull. Its head was also similar, boxy shape, except cartoonishly large for its body, and its snout was also boxy, but it stuck out far, almost like an alligator. It was like an exaggerated caricature of a cartoon dog brought to life. The fact that my friend and I both saw a fleeting image of the black dog chomping its jaws really freaked me out and intrigued me. I soon realized that my own dog was not in the woods at the time, and that freaked me out even more. For a long time, I was obsessed with the idea of a ghostly black dog stalking my woods. I know black dogs have been in legends as some sort of bad omen. Maybe not as exciting as some experiences, but this was my paranormal experience. Today's third encounter. Around 25 years ago, I was living in Boston. My friends and I would go to New Hampshire nearly every weekend, as one of our group had a family friend with a cabin in North Conway, White Mountain area. I had made acquaintance with an older man and later became friends with him, as we all did. He lived a few miles down the road from us. To preface this a bit, he had served in Vietnam in combat. He was one of the brightest, most intelligent, and intellectually engaging persons I'd ever met. An all-around good person, and a man's man, as the saying goes. If the trauma of service in wartime affected him, I never saw evidence of it. He was laid-back, jovial demeanor, quick wit. His attitude was that every day was a very good day. I once asked him how he stayed in such a positive, upbeat mood. I was then 20 years old, and like everyone that age, I had what I thought were real problems, and got into bad moods. He told me one night over a campfire John, when I was over there in Nam, I went through a lot, saw a lot, did a lot. It was hell. I swore to myself that if I ever got back home and out of the jungle, I would never have a bad day again, and I have not. I never forgot those words, so as you can likely gather, he was a very level-headed, grounded, intelligent man. Well, like many in rural New Hampshire and many in wooded areas, he always carried a handgun. Always. He carried two, I found out later, identical Smith & Wesson Model 29 44 Magnum revolvers with short 3-inch barrels. Not a very common gun in that particular configuration, so I recall them specifically even now. He loaded them with hand-loaded rounds. He had casted his own bullets, of mostly silver. Yeah, silver bullets. Probably a great way to ruin a barrel quickly. He told me and a few of us, in a very matter-of-fact tone, to never go outside at night if possible. Never. Someone in our group kind of laughed at it and made the remark of some kind. That's when he got very serious. His jovial demeanor was gone. He very seriously said, "Look, believe me or don't, I'm trying to save your lives. There are things out here that are not supposed to be. They shouldn't exist, yet they do. They're not bears, they are not deer. They're not anything that should be walking around, but they do just that. Stay in the house at night." He walked off, and when I saw him next, he was his old self. We talked a bit, and he told me then that he had seen what he believed to be werewolves, or they were the closest thing he could compare them to. He said that they were very large and very fast, and that he believed they were very intelligent. Maybe human-level intelligence. He also told me that's why he carried a heavy load 44 mag, which, for anywhere in New England, is really overkill. But he estimated their weight to be 450 to 500 pounds and their height to be 7 feet or more. He was 6'4" and said they had a foot or more on him in height. He had been within 20 yards of these things, and he said they tried to flank him. The main biggest one kept his attention, and the other two began what he called a classic flanking maneuver. He fired his gun into the ground as a warning, since he was not sure what he was dealing with, and wasn't sure that his gun would even be effective. He fired 2 rounds and then leveled his gun at the one facing him. He said it threw its arm and hand up in a reflective defensive posture, and then stared at the gun intently, as if it knew what it was and what it could do. It then made a loud noise, and it and the others ran off into the woods. A 44 mag from anything is loud. A 44 mag from a 3-inch barrel is horrendously loud for reference. He said he felt a primal fear that he has never known. He never felt it even in combat in Vietnam. This was a man who didn't scare easily, if at all. Whatever he saw scared him to his core. Hearing him explain it to me scared me, and I don't scare myself much. He didn't like being out at night at all, and wouldn't be out at night often. Today's 4th experience. My ex-girlfriend and I were playing video games late one night at her dad's house when she decided she wanted to go home. We're neighbors living in the country, and our homes were well within walking distance of each other. I noticed the time was 3 a.m. I continued to play a few more rounds with her brother before I decided it was time to go as well. At 3:30, I walked outside to pure darkness. The moon and stars were missing. I couldn't see a thing, and noted that the many dogs that usually greeted me before I left were not there. The silence was odd. I assumed they followed my ex home. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I left, but after what felt like 10 minutes, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I know the trail back well enough to walk it blind, so I did just that. There's a bush between her father's home and ours, and as I entered, I started to get this feeling of dread. All my senses were warning me of something I couldn't see. My anxiety was beginning to rise, but I steeled myself against my paranoia and kept on going. Once I was out of the bush, I saw the outside light shining in the distance. About halfway down the trail, I heard this tremendous crashing sound behind me. The sounds of snapping branches and rustling weeds, with a rumble of legs beating the ground. I turned around thinking the dogs were coming to escort me home. I was wrong. This was no dog. Time seemed to slow as I realized this was nothing I had ever seen before. I still question if I actually saw anything. It was blacker than the night, a void in the shape of some sort of humanoid creature with a feline head. It was difficult to describe, the absence of light having definition, but its black skin was stretched over a skeletal body. I'm a fairly tall guy, and this thing's back looked like it was my height of my torso. The shock of the encounter startled me into making a pathetic noise that makes me feel emasculated when I think about it. But I quickly went into flight or fight, and I decided to fight. I stomped my foot with a display of aggression, and I put my hands up, ready to hit this thing. It stopped 10 or so feet in front of me, and that's when I noticed it had hands. At mid-stride, it paused, and I saw that it had black, long, slender fingers. For a moment it stared at me, turned, and ran back where it had come from without making a sound. It had no tail, and I will always remember how graceful this thing looked, running the other direction. Its movements were fluid. My adrenaline peaked, and I was making these deep, powerful breaths as I walked back inside. When I locked the door, I had this sensation wash over me, telling me that locking the door was a useless gesture. I had the sudden feeling that reality was porous, and that the safety was an illusion. I spoke with people about what I saw, and I am told that it was some sort of spirit. Elders in the area told me it's been there well before their grandparents first warned them of its presence. I'm told it's powerful and can be summoned by people who use bad medicine. One day I gathered my courage and did a search of the bush. I found a swamp in the center of it. I never knew it was there in all my years living here. I love the night, but that encounter had me thinking twice before I go outside alone now. I bring a hunting knife with me, but I don't know if it will be any help against something like that. Nevertheless, I find comfort in my willingness to fight back if it ever attacks again. However, I don't know if it intended on harming me. Maybe it was sending me a message. I still can't explain where that claim of reality being porous came from. Today's fifth encounter. I'm not sure if this was a cryptid or simply an encounter. I was anywhere between 5 and 9 at the time, which means this was around a decade ago. I was homeschooled for most of my life, and it's very hard to keep track of time for me at this time, and years often had little distinction for me, with no reason to keep track of time outside of a young child's countdown for important holidays and birthdays. I didn't start registering what day of the week it was until I started public school at 15, but I do have clear memories of events I confirmed happened when I was 3, so I do feel I have a good recollection of this. I grew up on a farm that was sold by my grandmother over 5 years ago behind our backs to a farmer we rented our fields to after we had been promised 114 acres my family had been taking care of all my life. We didn't have much of a structure to our homeschooling, so it was often us doing things we could mark off as educational for homeschool evaluator at the end of the year, which meant we only had to give her a sample of physical homework, and this my mother rarely had us do until we needed them close to that evaluation. I say all of this to tell you just how much time I had to spend in the woods. It was my gym, and I could head out and play or walk the woods and stalk or chase after whatever animal I came across all day if I felt like it. I was a stupid kid when it came to wild animals. I once tried to pet an animal I thought was a cat that I had cornered under our back porch step, but looking back, I know it was clearly a raccoon. Glad its hissing told me off, and I didn't stick my hand under there to pet it. There was also coyotes in these woods, but my mom didn't believe this until she heard it from a man she allowed to trap on the property a few years before we were forced to move. I was likely a little small to be alone in the woods, as I would see them lined up against the tree line as I cut through the fields watching me sometimes. I swear there were 8 all watching me once. I'd run towards the dogs, which thankfully simply scared them into their burrows. As I became older, I never saw those coyotes, which makes me think they were likely looking for a snack. I saw a few animals that were off to me during my walks, and I recorded them in a notebook with other odd experiences sometime after this event. This notebook disappeared when I was 11 or so. The encounter itself happened in full daylight, sometime in the early afternoon. I was shooting arrows at a haystack behind my barn. I wasn't with anyone. My dad was working in his shop. These weren't anything sharp, but we still had good safety practices with them. I practiced so often at this time, I honestly wasn't bad at all. But this was a handmade English longbow, made to my height, so they were quite easy for my child self to pull into position at my cheek. I haven't found any modern bows to work as easily, but I didn't learn a lot about those and haven't done anything like it for a long time. I would go back and forth retrieving my arrows, as I only had 3. If I completely missed the haystack with my spray-painted target, these would go pretty far past them. We had a pasture off to the left connected to a barn and a large field all along to my right. When the pasture ended, the field carried on for about twice the distance. The land was bridged together by woods that started after the pasture had ended. So I just had the grass clearing far off into the distance where I would search for my painfully natural-looking arrows. As I was retrieving them, I noticed at the end of the far pasture we had one fenced in with wire, but was unusable, so that was just for a chicken field. There's a large, sort of bulky, if not muscular-looking dog sitting somewhat oddly. I'm close enough to see its shape quite distinctly, but being fully black, there wasn't a lot of details to make out, but I believe it may have had a dog-like snout. That could have been a false memory, as I was pretty convinced I was looking at a dog. My parents didn't have a dog, so curious to see one on the property, I wanted to approach the animal to see if I could befriend it. This seemed perfectly natural at the time, probably sounds pretty natural still, but I suddenly thought that I didn't notice it until I looked up, and it was quite close to me, meaning it might have been sitting there watching me for a potentially long time. 10 or so feet from the corner of the outer fence, it stood beside what was really marshy, overgrown grass and green area. It sat there for a minute as I began to get closer to it, and then pushed itself up, no longer sitting. I remember it looked so much taller doing that, like the length of its arms or front legs were hidden by the black hair in the distance. I say arms because this thing started swinging itself into the grass on its knuckles exactly like an ape. I saw it make maybe 3 of those motions and it was gone. I'm unsure if this animal had a tail or anything. I think its movement had disturbed me at that time, but for whatever reason, after walking all the way back to the barn, I simply told my dad I had seen a dog. I did talk about the weird experience with an acquaintance who lives in the area before, and she was convinced she had seen something like I had described at one point, but I don't recall if she ever told me the story. What did I see? Was it an ape, a dogman, or what in rural Pennsylvania? We haven't had bear sightings in this area in a very long time, though one or two pop up from time to time, but I don't know. Tonight's final encounter. I would like to say first that I've always believed in paranormal, even though this was my first time I've ever witnessed anything. Also, English is not my first language, so I apologize for any errors I may have made. I am an 18-year-old male. I live in northwestern France, Normandy, and it's not a place with endless forest. It's flat and boring. Since I was a kid, I would stay for 2 weeks during the spring holidays at my grandparents' house in the Jura region of eastern France. The Jura region is a hilly place with a lot of forests and amazing wildlife, so it's the opposite of where I'm from. During my time here, I usually go deep into the woods to pick mushrooms and berries, and I've never seen anything weird. The animals you see are deer, fox, badger, wild boar, squirrels, rabbits, and very recently, wolves have been brought back to this area in France. If I remember correctly, it was the 2nd of May, 2022. And, as I said, I was in the forest near the village of Guérin to pick berries. I was alone and there was no one around, but it was not something strange because it's a very sparsely populated part of France. The thing that felt strange was the fact that I didn't see any animals, no deer, no wild boar, no fox. It was silent, I'm not gonna lie. I was starting to get scared because the silence was making me uncomfortable. But I decided to keep picking berries because my mom wanted to make some pies, and I love her pies. I was walking in the woods, and I could see a clair. I think the word in English is a clearing. And I was thinking about taking a break in this place because I had been walking for almost an hour. It was until I saw this very big and dark mass. It was bipedal, and it was standing in the clearing. I stopped walking and I was staring at the thing behind the trees for like 20 seconds before running back to the village. It was very tall and hairy, probably 210 centimeters or 7 feet for Americans. It looked like a bipedal wolf or like a half dog, half human. I don't know if that thing saw me, but I did not put a foot in this forest since then. When I was back at my grandparents' house, I gave my mom the berries I had picked and I stayed in my room for the rest of the day. I did a lot of research about wildlife in the Jura region to see if I saw some kind of rare animal, but no. What I saw was not an animal. While doing the research, I stumbled across the story from the 16th century. It's a story of a werewolf that was killing children in the village of Ménage in Jura. Even though Ménage is a pretty far from Guérin, it's still in the Jura area, so there is a possible connection. I was freaked out by this discovery, but I wanted to know more about werewolf stories in this part of France, so I watched a 2-hour-long video about 2 women who were talking about what they saw in Jura. When I looked at the drawing that one of the women in the video did, my heart stopped because it looked exactly like what I had seen. I know that werewolves are part of the Jura folklore. There's even a celebration that takes place the last weekend of June to celebrate the story of the werewolf of Ménage. Since this experience, I haven't been able to sleep well at my grandparents' house because I felt like I was being watched. The view from my window is nothing but big forest, so it's not reassuring. I've been back in Normandy since May 9th, but I'm thinking about it every day, and now I want to go back. I didn't tell anyone about this sighting yet because I don't want to sound crazy, and I don't have any pictures to prove that I'm not lying. Here's a bonus encounter. I'm not a great storyteller, but this is what happened to me. We were staying at a Hogan Airbnb on the Navajo Nation close to Monument Valley, and there were several very friendly, calm dogs roaming around. My friends and I, one of whom is deathly afraid of dogs, had no problem being with them or petting them. We had a gorgeous view of Monument Valley right from our door, and it was cold yet cozy. That night I needed to use the restroom. I opened the door to the dogs going absolutely nuts. There is a difference between a dog barking at just whatever, a person walking by, for example, and then there was this total fight or flight response. One of the dogs ran up to me looking anxious and glancing into the desert behind the Hogan. It came close, then walked back to look into the desert behind the Hogan. Its spur stood up, and it suddenly looked more like a wolf, and took off into the desert at full speed, growling and barking at a huge shadow that ran away from the dog. There aren't many huge animals in the area, some deer and horses, maybe cattle, but this was way bigger. I didn't stick around long enough to check out what it was. I was pretty shaken by what I saw. Found some fresh wolf/mountain lion prints and hoof prints, probably from a horse, outside the Hogan the next morning. The dog prints were smaller. Our host said we may have seen a skinwalker. I'd like to believe it was a horse. It was dark anyhow, but the host didn't want to talk about it too much. The guides we met later on said the same thing and kept it at that. Later that day, one friend suddenly fell ill on the tour of another Hogan and almost fainted. That never happened before in her life. The guide said she probably had some bad spirits attached to her. She recovered quickly after stepping outside. That's all. This was a real wonderful trip overall, and I'd go again. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's upload as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Some terrifying encounters. How about that one in France, man? Just, it's crazy to hear encounters from other countries because, being American, I think of Dogman as an American cryptid, even though I know better. But just instantly, But yet, France has had hundreds of years of dogman encounters there, called werewolves, but, so definitely interesting. So, with that, my friends, I hope you enjoyed it. Please stay safe, and may the Great Spirit watch over you all, and may he guide you down that path that, we call life.